Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the show. Today, we're talking about the role of architecture and architects in data strategy. And to do that, I've got with me Rob White. He's an independent consultant specializing in all things enterprise architecture and digital transformation. Rob, welcome along to the show. Thanks for coming.
Thanks a lot, Jason. Great to be here.
No problem. So let's kick off with a bit about you, a bit about your background and how you got into this space. Because I'm knowing you a little bit, I know it's not necessarily typical of people that I talk to on the show in the sort of data world. So yeah, let's kick off with that.
So I've been in enterprise architecture since about 2006. My backstory on this really is I was first half of my career, I was in the army, military officer in the Royal Artillery. That was for 13 years. The second half of that, so for sort of 7 or so years, I got into technology-enabled business transformation programs, and on that route, came across architecture, enterprise architecture, as a means of solving business problems. I was very much brought up in the world of getting on and doing things in an operational environment, as you may imagine, as an army officer. So I was always action oriented and wanting to get stuff done. I'm finding myself at the back end of my career working in the Ministry of Defence in large scale tech programs, particularly difficult to get stuff done, and discovered that architecture actually had a bunch of tools and techniques and approaches that I found very useful, and sort of latched onto those. And that's how I got interested in architecture as a discipline, really as a way of solving problems and getting stuff done, simplifying the complex, and bringing stakeholders onto a common consensus as to the way forward. So that's where I started. I left the military at the back end of 2008 and started to apply what I'd learned back in those days in the commercial world. Worked at large system integrator and smaller consultancy, and then went into independent consultancy, working for myself since 2012. So for about 10 years now.
Okay. Well, as I say, yeah, not the usual route into sort of data. And I know you're sort of broader than data, actually, much more kind of enterprise architecture and digital transformation, which of course you can't do and really think about without considering the data and how you maximize it. But let's come to that. But you're interested in the kind of the experience in the forces, and I can see you sort of moved into some of the sort of program delivery there. But is there a kind of set of skills or set of, I don't know, mindsets or approaches that kind of have really helped to give you a different way of approaching problems in commercial world and industry?
I think it probably has. Sometimes difficult to see that when you only have your own experiences, but
true.
But I think the discipline that is taught, and when I think of discipline, I mean a structured approach to thinking rather than what you might refer to as military discipline, but the disciplined approach to approaching problems and how to solve them. You very much get taught as a junior officer the orders process and how orders are cascaded down from the top very quickly down to the bottom, and that only happens through repeating a process. So everybody learns that process out of the gate, and practices many times over their career as they get promoted, and applying it at each level, one level higher than the last. So you build this sort of discipline of mission analysis, understanding what's being asked, understanding the wider context, and then breaking it down, looking at the factors that are going to influence how to solve the problem that you're looking at, what the deductions are, how you sort of tie these deductions together into potential courses of action, and then you assess each of the courses of action for pros and cons against a set of assessment criteria, and rapidly, if that's required, rapidly choose the appropriate course of action,
and of course at pace.
Well, yes, and I very much remember the sergeant major when I was at Sandhurst screaming at us to make a effing decision.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's drilled in, and so
Yeah.
that process, although it was probably a fairly long-winded way of describing it, it can be executed in a matter of moments,
Hmm.
or in the case of planning a military campaign, over several weeks or even months
Yeah.
if required.
Yeah.
So it scales from micro to macro. And
what's interesting for me there, just sort of with the data lens on, is ultimately data is all about helping to make an organization make decisions, either strategically, where do we go, what do we do, how do we get the opportunity, or tactically or operationally, how do we fix the problem we've got now. So that kind of decision framework, I think, can be really nicely applied to the sharp end of what data is about, which is giving insight to people to help make better, more informed decisions, either really quickly in the moment because we've got quick, good access to data and insight, or longer play kind of trending of what's happening so that we can move or steady or focus the ship and the troops in the right way. I sort of like that analogy. I think there's sort of I'm sure that's got some legs in data strategy somewhere as well. So yeah, look, great to hear your background, and you got into kind of architecture. Have you found that there are different facets, types of architecture? There's obviously industry names like enterprise architect and solution architect and data architecture, but is there different types of architects, and what's really the role of architects and architecture in business?
Yes, there are, and I think it's a term and a discipline that's not actually that well understood broadly. Often it's overcomplicated, and that's often the fault of the architects. And I'm not exactly sure why, but sometimes it may serve people's purposes to sort of mystify the black art. And if you're not inside the tent, it's all very complicated. Actually, I come at it from a completely the opposite end, and actually, I think the value of architecture is simplifying the complex. But just certainly in general terms, but to get back to your question about the types of architects, I split the world into two halves, the architecture world into two halves, and the two halves are pre-project and during project. So all the strategy and planning and thinking, shaping that happens before a project or a set of projects and program or portfolio of projects is mobilized.
Yeah.
All of that really is enterprise architecture to me. And enterprise architecture can then be split down into the different domains of architecture: business architecture, application architecture, infrastructure architecture, data architecture, of course, and security architecture. But it would be always pre-project. So you're shaping, you're doing thinking, maybe putting in principles, practices, design patterns, reusable building blocks, understanding dependencies. The world of change in anything other than a trivial organization is exponentially more complex the more you add a dependency in. So the more things you have and the more relationships you have between things, the more exponentially more complex it becomes. So breaking these things down and enabling, really, I think the goal of enterprise architecture is to make project delivery as easy as it possibly can be, but by setting up projects for success, by giving them the understanding of the wider context, the focus of the individual project, where its boundaries are, where it fits into the bigger picture, what it can reuse, a whole bunch of knowledge artifacts, if you will, so they hit the ground running and they can be as successful as they can. And then within the project, then you've got really solution architecture, which again has all the same facets: data facet, application facet, business process, products, and such like. So,
and how does there, in the solution architect sort of project delivery mode, is it a different set of activities? Is it much more about assurance and quality than it is about thinking and planning and design? So what's the difference, I guess, when you're in pre-project and in project mode in your mind?
Well, there are certainly some similarities if you stand far enough back. So things like the role of the architect really is to produce architecture artifacts, and the artifacts themselves don't do anything in their own right. They're typically either a model of, a document or something of that nature. So the only value that they can add is to help other people to do their job better. So those artifacts would be produced at the enterprise level and the solution level. They just need to be different. But ultimately, for those artifacts to be successful, they need to address the concerns of stakeholders. So the stakeholders that you have at the enterprise level are a different set than you'd have at the project solution level. Certainly there'd be an overlap. So think of the Venn diagram. There'd be an overlap between those stakeholders. But whoever the stakeholders are and whatever their concerns are, and by concerns I mean what complexities do they need to get resolved so that they can understand the environment to make better decisions faster,
right,
then create artifacts that help people do that. I mean, it's very easy to say the TOGAF framework says I need a capability model. Well, if it's not actually going to be useful to address stakeholders' concerns, it's potentially an overhead. So making sure that the artifacts you produce are easy to understand, directed at addressing the concerns, coherent with each other, etc., etc. But it's really just a case of scope. So you mentioned governance. Yes, there's governance at the enterprise level. There's also governance and assurance at the project level. So it's more a question of scale, I would say, rather than difference. But
is it about technology? Is it about technology systems, or is it about something broader than that, either philosophically broader or actually broader? Sort of, is it about enabling business things, or is it about designing technology solutions? Now, of course, those things are closely aligned, but just from a conceptual point of view, what do you think the architecture thing is all about?
Yeah, that is a good question. I think the purest answer to that is it's not about technology. I think the pragmatic answer often is about technology. So trying to divorce it from and saying you need no technical understanding to be a good architect is, from a purist's perspective, true, but pragmatically, because technology and data pervades almost everything, the number of cases where technology has nothing to do with the problem domain or the solution domain is limited. But it is certainly possible to apply architectural thinking into domains where there is no technology or no IT specifically, certainly. And it's, for me, again, thinking of it from more the purist perspective, it's all about the way of thinking rather than being gemmed up on the latest technology trends. Although you do ultimately end up often in that world. So I think it's a bit of both, really. I guess I sort of guess that would be where you'd land up. But it's interesting because all of these things are about impacting the business in some way, and of course you can map an organization in context of its processes, and that could be architecture. You can map a system in terms of what it needs to do and how it needs to work in order to support and deliver those processes. So it comes together, doesn't it? I mean, to do that, and obviously there's some very technical thinking at one end of the spectrum, and there's some very business thinking at the other end of the spectrum. Of course, those things actually might not be a big spectrum these days in sort of digital native organizations, for sure. But if there are a set of or certain skills and behaviors that you think are relevant to become an architect, or to understand where an architect's coming from? Yes, I think there are. I think you've got to be very interested in how things work. My background from school and university was maths and science, and it sort of drills into a way of, well, I think I was probably attracted to those subjects as a young lad because I was interested in the way things worked. I was always sort of taking things to pieces and putting them back together and hoping they would still work and such like. And sometimes they did and sometimes they didn't. But it was a great learning sort of environment to do that and play with Meccano and such like. And I think it's that kind of, are you interested in the way things work? I always assumed that everybody was. And now I've actually learned that quite a few people aren't. And actually that's where it takes a village to raise a child, as they say. So it's all those different types of skills and interests and such like. But I would say this one time, but I definitely think there's a place for people who are interested in understanding how things work and understanding the dependencies. And if you pull this lever, what are the ripple effects?
Yeah.
I think there's a really good role for architects to help out with impact assessments. And if we were to do this, what are the downstream impacts? Everything's, as I said before, everything's connected to everything. So you pull on one string, and especially in a project world, there are, the laws of unintended consequences. They're out there all the time. How many projects have we seen fail because we didn't have the visibility or the blind visibility into the blind spot of, I didn't realize that was going to happen. And often we've used the architectural process and architectural thinking right up front with project ideation to look at the viability of a project by looking at that impact assessment. And one organization really springs to mind that I worked in for a couple of years and got to know very, very well. Their mainframe was at the heart of everything. The mainframe couldn't be touched because of stability, cost, and testing, and a whole bunch of reasons. And so we developed this upfront process that looked at any idea and then followed the dependencies to see at which point it would touch the mainframe, and if it didn't, that often came to, is it a viable project or not? Can we protect the mainframe? And using this sort of dependency analysis type approach to very quickly go to the stakeholders who are interested in the initiative, whether it was going to be a viable proposition or not. And that cut out, once we started doing that cut out a lot of preventable noise, which is just a drain on an organization if it keeps thinking of ideas that are never going to fly. That's just wasted effort. So
I can see that. I mean, just going back to your point on one of the key skills you mentioned there about being interested in, or certainly facets being really interested in the way things work. And then you sort of talk about how some people aren't. I guess your point is, to be an architect, you need to, but you're interacting with people that either aren't that way tuned, or don't frankly need to know how it works, and their aspiration is that it works and that it delivers on a benefit or a thing they're trying to achieve. It is one of the important components or behaviors of an architect, then being able to take that understanding of how something works and even real passion for it and motivation for it, and almost sort of helping the organization to understand how it works, or indeed play it in a way that people don't need to understand how it works, but just that it's going to do the thing it's supposed to do. Because I ask that because I often can see architects sort of getting frustrated by the fact that people don't understand how it works and don't care about how it works, and they want to explain it. They want people to get it. They want people to understand it, and it's not always necessary. So, A, do you think it's necessary for people to always understand it? And B, is there a behavioural thing here about how you live in a world where people don't understand how it works and don't want to?
Yeah, very, very much. I think from my perspective, the answer would be know your audience. And what I mean by that is, there's often no point trying to get somebody to understand something that you think they need to understand if they're just not interested in it.
Yeah,
it's about back to addressing their concerns. One of the, well, really, in my sort of playbook for architecture, the first thing to do is a stakeholder analysis. Like, who are the key players? What are their interests? What's the best way of communicating with them? A lot of people love a visual, but not everybody. Some people love the detail, not everybody. In fact, a lot of people don't. And the more you're dealing with more and more senior people, the less detail that they want, but they want confidence. So there's I don't want the detail, but I want the confidence. How do you navigate that conundrum? And sometimes it's by trial and error. I think the idea of the sort of the MVP, test and learn, try stuff out with people. Here's 3 pictures I've drawn of the same thing. Which one do you like? Almost.
Yeah, which one fits? Yeah.
Which one? And I've sort of done. I mean, that sounds a bit terse and a bit like you wouldn't actually do that in real life, but I sort of have done. Not black and white. I've drawn 3 pictures for you. Which one? Which one do you like? But
you test it with people and see what resonates.
Exactly that. And the message I'm trying to convey is this. Here's the artifact that I think solves that problem, and you can see it in the response of the glazing over of eyes.
Yeah,
I've had that far too many times, but it's great because you learn. It's like, oh, this individual doesn't benefit from this, and life's too short to create artifacts that people don't want.
No, quite, and you can get buried in just creating documents for documents. I like the idea of sort of A/B testing. This is not just for architects actually, but kind of A/B testing. What messages work for what types of audiences, and tailoring messages to ensure people understand. It's not about tricking people, but ensuring they understand the message that you're trying to give, and that might take a few goes. I mean, where that sort of leads my thinking as well is on the kind of the accountabilities and responsibilities of an architect, and again, because they're typically, I've seen there's no responsibility for the execution of the thing that's been designed. And this might just be how it's been worked in the past, but really it's about, as you say, thinking, planning, overseeing, assurance, designing stuff. So, but the people who are actually sort of hands-on building the thing tend to sort of be a little bit more on the hook for the output of it. So, is this there's a sort of danger, and this I've seen again in particularly large organisations where there's big architecture teams sort of isolated from or separate from everybody else, is it can be a bit sort of ivory tower and sort of sat there designing stuff and going, go deliver and I'll tell you if it's right or not. So where's the kind of accountability and responsibility for architects? And I imagine your sort of pre-project and during project kind of thing comes in here, but is there a clear distinction between what an architect's accountable and responsible for versus other people, or does it depend?
I think often the problem in organizations is we don't make things clear in this space. And that is a problem, because where people aren't clear, then unnecessary friction occurs. Yeah. But I think there is an optimal way of organizing these things. And even going to the level of documenting it in some kind of racy matrix could be useful for, depending on the culture and the style of organization you've got. But I think in simple terms, I would like to see architects to be responsible for the process of getting decisions made. So if you think of a decision, and this is something I've used to levels of success on a few occasions, and that is a decisions log. And not typically people think of a decisions log as a log of all the decisions that we have made. So once a decision is made, get it in the decisions log, because here's a decision, we need to make sure we've captured it.
Remember we decided something.
Yeah. Whereas and there's nothing wrong with that. I think that's good practice. But the decisions log that I like to promote is one that also includes the decisions that haven't yet been made. And those are, in many respects, more important for the organization. So first of all, identifying which decisions need to be made. And then when you go through sort of a brainstorming exercise, you very quickly come up with a list of 100, 150, 200, that's, oh shit, there's loads of stuff to opine on and make decisions on. But we don't need to make all of those decisions all at the same time. And actually, when you think about it and do a bit of additional analysis on those, it becomes clear that there are dependencies between decisions, and decision A can't be made until decision B has already been made. So don't worry about the downstream decisions. Let's focus our efforts on the ones that are most impactful and urgent, the upstream decisions. So this is a way of actually organizing the workforce to focus on what decisions are most important, and then work out a team, an individual who's going to be responsible for getting the decision from not made to made. And now that doesn't mean that that individual is actually responsible for making the decision. In fact, if we make an architect responsible for getting the body of stakeholders through the decision-making process, some of these are literally a 5-minute effort, but often, especially when there's a lot of trade-offs, or the impact of going down one fork versus another is strategically important for an organization. This probably isn't a decision that's going to be made on a whim on a Friday afternoon. It might take a lot of consultation and going back and doing more homework about impacts and what will really happen if we go if we take course of action A versus course of action B. But presenting all the decision grade material, the architectural artifacts that can support the decision making, the factors. Back to what I was talking about really when I was thinking and talking you through the military orders process and assessing the factors. So gathering all the factors that impact a decision, often bringing them together in some kind of visual to make sense of, here are all the factors, these are the pressures, these are the pros and cons and such like, and presenting decision grade material to hopefully a tight knit group of stakeholders.
And recommendation as well, or is it really more just about presenting the facts, almost like the organization, the Joint Biosecurity Agency, who was producing all the COVID data, wasn't making the decision about whether to go into lockdown or not. They were providing the data to the government, who were then making the decision. So there's a kind of clear distinction between sort of provision of insight and decision making, but there's a bit in the middle which is a recommendation. So we recommend that you do. And is that in the kind of kit bag of an architect, or is it more sort of like the insight, the diagrams, the facts, if you like, rather than the recommendation?
I think it can be either, and it might be specific context dependent, or it might be organizationally dependent, what works in the organization. I think whatever's helpful. Often I think groups of stakeholders like to have a recommendation. So the hard facts analysis, without the emotional component, would lead you to this conclusion. But
be aware there's these.
You're looking at it from your perspective. The decision makers often have a wider context that's not available to the individuals on the ground presenting this. And so one of the problems I see with architects is developing a favored solution, and that can happen when you're asked for a recommendation, and then it becomes
drive all the insight to lead to the favored solution.
So
human nature in a way, but
we used to call that situating the estimate,
right.
which means sort of fitting the evidence to fit the preconceived idea of what the best course of action is. Obviously that's the wrong way to do it, but also even when you've taken a dispassionate view, done objective rather than subjective analysis, and come up with the right answer, if the decision makers above you don't come to the same conclusion, there's often a feeling of they don't understand, they don't value me, or it can become quite personal. So from that perspective, not making a recommendation has its advantages, but actually it's really what is the cultural environment, what do the decision makers need.
There's a kind of place, there's obviously a place for all of this, and I'm just kind of playing through my mind how some of the kind of upfront thinking, strategy, design type activity, and then the delivery activity come together, and in a kind of an agile world where you're sort of starting small, testing, iterating, constantly improving, and you kind of haven't got the end state defined, and where we're trying to get to defined necessarily, because we're really just in a small kind of minimum viable world, and seeing how it lands before we then go and sort of invest a little bit more and then go and put some more functionality in. So there's sort of more kind of agile iterative development approach that kind of digital does, data does a little bit more these days. How, is that a challenge for architects or architecture where really certainly historically it's been, let's design the end state and then maybe deliver it iteratively, but in an agile world you don't know the end state, because the whole point is that you're kind of testing what's going to work and then letting the solution sort of pivot to the place it needs to be. So how do you balance the kind of need for flexibility and agility in what the solution needs to be based on what we learn, and there needs to be some kind of end state, and what we build needs to be scalable?
Yeah, I think what we've learned from agile as a better way of doing at least certain things. I don't think agile is a silver bullet which can be applied to any environment. I think most people would probably agree on that now.
Yeah.
For example, building a bridge across the River Thames, it's probably not an agile an agile development methodology is probably not best. It's probably get it up front design and then build that thing.
Yeah,
there'll be some learnings as we go, of course. So it's not sort of completely black and white.
Yeah.
But I think in most cases, especially in complex organizations, I often think of an organization as a complex adaptive system, and there's quite a lot of reading that I've done on that. Things like the Cynozure framework, if people in your audience are familiar with Dave Snowden's work, where operating in a complex adaptive system, his best practices that he talks a lot about is coming up with safe to fail experiments. So it's very much, you have a hypothesis, you test it out in a way that's safe to fail. You learn from the experience and you feed that into your requirements and design.
Yeah,
that's all well and good, and that sort of points you away from not needing architecture at all. So I've certainly got that in mind on one hand, but also on the other hand, I think it's very helpful for an organization to have a vision as to which way is north, what is the direction of travel, even if it's only at a high level of these are the KPIs that we want to move the needle on. And as an example, an organization I was working with did a lot of deep problem analysis and identified that the ability for junior sales staff to actually sell was a key problem that they wanted to address.
Right.
And so the architectural framework that we then started to address that, we didn't know how the problem would be solved, but we needed an architectural framework within which to operate. So a skeleton high level framework was set out, and then within that framework we set up these hypotheses and started testing them, and the results of those, we thought this was going to happen, it did, thumbs up. We thought this was going to happen, it didn't, thumbs down. All led to the more micro level design within the framework. And when the framework is proven to be inappropriate because of what's been learned bottom up, then it's just a case of evolving it, and hopefully you've not set things up in such a rigid way that changing the high level view of the direction is going to break the business case. That would be a bad thing. But it also feeds into how do you set up the high level framework so that evolving it isn't a cost prohibitive activity. So it's setting up the project for success by providing it with a flexible environment in which to experiment in the direction of north, which in the case of the sales problem was KPIs around sales productivity.
It's interesting. It comes back to your decision making framework, doesn't it? Really, because the kind of safe to fail experiments, or any experiment, is to get some more insight in order to help make a decision about whether to, what to do, where to go, what to build, what to add. So in some ways, it's kind of connected with that. Getting insight, getting data in order to help make a decision, and in experiments, it's a decision about what to do next. It's really interesting how those things connect, and it sort of certainly changed this conversation. Certainly changed my thinking a little bit on how the role architects can play in designing and shaping the execution and the setting of data strategy, if the context of data strategy is about helping an organization to make better decisions through the use of data analytics insight, and if that is essentially the role of architects, and architecture is to help put a better decision-making framework in place and help make better decisions, it looks like it really fits quite nicely. I'm not sure all architects and architecture functions think that way, but I can see your logic and your thinking about how those sort of things come together. So yeah, it's fascinating stuff.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's common practice at this point. 2022, the world of architecture, and certainly architecture at the enterprise level, was probably really kicked off in the early 80s, mid 80s by John Zachman. So we've had a fair crack at it over a number of decades now, but we certainly haven't got it cracked. And
time for a refresh. Feels like it.
I wouldn't say maybe a refresh, maybe a re-examination of what it means to be helpful. One of the things we've not touched on during the conversation is that of being of service. It's sort of been there in the background, but on the basis that architects don't actually change business processes, write lines of code, etc., I think it's much more beneficial if the mindset of the architect is one of being of service to others to help them do their job better. There's no point being there unless there's some value. So what is it? So really getting back to the basics of how can I be as valuable as an individual, as a team? Who are our stakeholders? How can we be most helpful? That for me, and that needs to be learned through experimentation, as we were saying. You don't necessarily know, and out of the gate what is, and it evolves, it changes. The business world, the change world is forever changing itself. So
well, some of the stuff you didn't sort of talk about when we were chatting around kind of skills and behaviors is sort of change, and I think architects are helping to enable change most of the time. So they're kind of change agents in a way, and responsible for helping to shape what change looks like. But also that level of, you say you're not responsible for building, but they're creators, right? They're creating things in the same way that you would sort of think of a building architect. If a building architect designs a beautiful building and that gets built, it's often it's not the guy that laid the bricks, it's the lady that designed the building that gets the accolades, right? And it can't, so there's kind of, I'm not sure we've got that, not in the kind of enterprise architecture world necessarily. It's not like that enterprise architect designed the most beautiful solution, but I think there's something there, right? There's that kind of creation. There's that.
I think the reason behind I think the reason behind that is it's not that visible. Like the spectacular skyscraper, you can go, wow, who designed that?
Yes.
When you say, oh, what an awesomely lean and efficient organization, how you've got the organizational design, the business processes, the data flows, and the technology singing in harmony. People don't go, how beautiful that enterprise architect.
Well, maybe they should. Maybe they should.
Oh, yeah, maybe that's the refresh that we need.
There we go.
For the next decade. Then.
There we go. Well, what a brilliant place to finish. I'm going to award you with the accolade of the first ever industry enterprise architect creator award. There we go. We heard it here first.
Thank you very much, and it's much appreciated.
Very good. Well, Rob, thanks very much for coming on the show. It's been brilliant discussion. Loved your thoughts and insights on this, and definitely sparked some thinking about how to position and understand the role of the architect. So really appreciate you coming on the show.
Great. It's been a pleasure for me too. Thanks.
Brilliant. Great. Thanks, Rob. And thanks everyone. I hope you enjoyed the show, and we'll catch you next time.